Welcome to the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. The title of today's episode is Trump right about everything? Is he even thinking beyond his term? I want to remind you to subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, and share it with your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. So is President Trump right about everything? Is he even thinking beyond his term? President Trump was recently wearing a hat that read, "Trump was right about everything." Imagine wearing that about yourself, and I would suggest that it's a major character flaw that someone would wear such a thing, that someone would wear something saying that they were right about everything. And the narcissist in chief takes pride and selfishness to unprecedented heights. He seems incapable of shame or embarrassment, with no ability to recognize or care how inappropriate or off-putting things like this are. I had a former boss or mentor early in my professional career who once said to me, "Let others compliment you or say how great you are. Don't say it yourself." That was advice that I tried to take to heart from that point some nearly 40 years ago. But most importantly, it's simply not true that Trump was or is right about everything. I mean, of course not. It's not true of anybody. And it's certainly not true about President Trump. In fact, I would suggest that it's not even remotely difficult to demonstrate that it's not true for him. And I think it's important to do that because it's very concerning to watch most elected Republicans and members of the Trump First media act as if it's true that Trump is right about everything. Now, full disclosure, full disclaimer, we have to acknowledge that President Trump is often right. He's right more than most politicians. And he is doing a lot of great things and has done a lot of great things in his first 7 months back in office. Those would include stopping the border invasion, deporting hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens, shrinking the federal workforce by some 300,000, requiring federal workers to come back to work in person, trying to dismantle the Department of Education, which, side note, the reason Speaker Johnson hasn't put that on the floor for a vote is because he knows Republicans won't vote actually to do that. But President Trump is trying to do it through executive action. His unleashing of American energy, his reversing of harmful green or climate regulations, eliminating racist and discriminatory DEI policies in our federal government on our college campuses, addressing violent crime in Washington, D.C., protecting free speech and religious freedom by not enforcing the Johnson Amendment, the unconstitutional Johnson Amendment, which for some 70 years now has suppressed free speech and freedom of religion in our churches and religious charities. And he's been eliminating 10 regulations for every new one in this term, even exceeding the numbers of regulatory eliminations that he did in his first term, and executing the World Health Organization, WHO. Those are just some of the outstanding actions, executive actions, taken by this president during his first 7 months in office. But word of caution once again, most, if not all of these, are easily reversible by the next Democrat president. All we have to do is think back 4.5 years ago to January of 21 and the executive actions taken by Joe Biden, the worst president in certainly modern history. President Trump is the best president of my lifetime. Now, he doesn't have a whole lot of competition. Only Ronald Reagan, I would say, is in competition with him during my lifetime. But in terms of the actions President Trump has taken, I think he's been the best president of my lifetime because he does take bold, decisive, courageous action. And most presidents don't do it at the level that he does. And again, he is right about many things. And for that matter, Joe Biden was right about nothing, literally nothing. But how wrong and how dangerous to the republic to pretend that Trump is right about everything or that he has been right about everything. And that's especially problematic for those with a responsibility to tell us the truth, elected Republicans and those in the media whose job it is to hold all of government accountable, even if they're conservative media and we have a conservative leading government. But instead, they pretend with their silence or sometimes their spoken affirmation that President Trump is right on everything. They pretend that what Trump says is right unconditionally. That what Trump says is conservative unconditionally. That what Trump says is America first unconditionally. And that what Trump says is constitutional unconditionally. That is a problem for elected Republicans and conservative media to do that. Trump often does exhibit good political and policy instincts, but we have to acknowledge he is not a constitutional conservative. And it seems doubtful to me that he's ever even read the Constitution. He seems to understand or care little for the constitutional limits of the executive branch or the executive office or the president. He doesn't have a true conservative core, and he prefers populism to conservatism. In other words, he wants to do what's popular. We'll come back to that a little bit later in this podcast. But that said, President Trump clearly loves America and wants the best for the American people. But the founders knew and repeatedly warned that the greatest threat to our liberty was at the hands of those we trust most. And the reason for that was because we tend to not hold accountable those we trust or give the benefit of the doubt to those we trust and not to provide appropriate oversight or accountability to them. The founders knew, however, that human nature drives those with power to try to expand it and retain it at all costs if left unchecked. And that those with power would ultimately abuse that power for their selfish interests and purposes. Like, for example, President Trump threatening to run for a third term, I might add. More on that later. But the founders knew that it was the ultimate responsibility of the people to prevent abuse of power, even by those whom they trust or respect. The founders knew that the greatest potential abuse of power in a free country like ours was in the name of safety and security. That a free people was most vulnerable to surrendering freedom in the face of danger. That our freedom is our freedom today is being taken by a government promising to take care of us and to protect us. That particularly happens during times of crisis or times of emergency. Think about COVID, what happened to us just a couple of years ago. So that said, what has President Trump been wrong about? And I'm going to point out 4 major areas where President Trump has been wrong. Number one, his failure to address the fiscal crisis. I talk about this often. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. The passing of the big ugly bill, which will do nothing to change the $20 to $25 trillion our national debt will increase over the next 10 years. But instead, the big ugly bill will make it about $6 trillion worse as it stands now. President Trump's refusal to address entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. They've got to be addressed. They've got to be reformed. In the case of Social Security, Medicare, they've got to be preserved and protected for today's retirees and future retirees as they're expected to go bankrupt in the next 6 or 7 years. And Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are consuming all of our federal revenues. And so that is a failure. President Trump is wrong not to address that, especially in his second term when he doesn't have to run for re-election. His demand for a $5 trillion increase to the debt limit in the big ugly bill, that's a fiscal failure. And his support for the CR back in March, and I expect his support for another CR, another continuing resolution here in September, when Republicans have full control of government, and they're yet going to continue the Biden, Pelosi, Schumer spending levels and policies that have been in place since Democrats had full control of government. Our debt has crossed $37 trillion, and it's on track to reach about $45 trillion during President Trump's second and final term. This should bother you. This should concern you. This should worry you, if not terrify you, for the future of our kids and our grandkids. Matter of fact, Trump joined Elizabeth Warren earlier this year in calling to eliminate the debt limit. In other words, the nation's credit card limit, so that Congress and the president can come together and just keep spending our money without that limit, that is the debt ceiling. Anyone think that will help out our $2 trillion annual deficits and our $37 trillion national debt if we just eliminate the debt limit, and that way it doesn't even give a pause for Congress to fight over whether or not to cut spending because they've reached the debt limit. Why do we only hate borrowing, spending, debt, and deficits when Democrats do it? The fact is, we lose liberty and our freedom with every dollar borrowed and spent by the federal government. They are increasing the debt while decreasing our purchasing power and the affordability of the American dream. And Americans are suffering as a result of that today, especially young people for whom the American dream is out of reach. The borrower is a slave to the lender. That's a biblical principle. And we are big-time slaves as a people to our national debt. I mentioned this before, but we need the kind of bold fiscal leadership that's being demonstrated by the president in Argentina, Javier Milei, who has cut spending by a third. That'd be over $2 trillion if we did that here, generating strong economic growth and a budget surplus. That's what he's done in Argentina. Do we have to reach the situation in Argentina that resulted in his election a couple of years ago before Republicans or Americans in general will demand that our elected representatives implement fiscal responsibility? So number one, where President Trump's been wrong is failing to address the fiscal crisis. Number two, President Trump's been wrong by not seeming to think or care about beyond his term or beyond 2028. It seems like much of his actions are devoted to just the next 3.5 years. In fact, Trump said that we, or specifically Christians like me and many of you, that we wouldn't even have to vote anymore after the last election back in November of 24. At Turning Point Action's Believers Summit in West Palm Beach, Florida, back on July 26 of 24, so a little over a year ago, President Trump said, and I quote, "Christians, get out and vote. Just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years. You know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians." Let me repeat that. This is a quote from President Trump last summer, July of 24, at Turning Point Action's Believers Summit in West Palm Beach, Florida. He said, "Christians, get out and vote just this time. You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years. You know what? It'll be fixed. It'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians." That certainly seems to indicate that he doesn't care about 2028 or future elections after his term. Some of his other words and actions, however, seem to confirm this short-term focus. After promising to end the Russian-Ukraine war in 24 hours, he now seems desperate for any kind of a deal. Any kind of a deal to temporarily end the Russia-Ukraine conflict, even if it lets Russia retain new territory without any consequences for their actions. His priority seems designed to ensure that there's no more fighting, at least until after he leaves office. This is similar to how sometimes he has seemed desperate to end the Israel-Hamas conflict, even at Israel's expense, because he said that he would end it very quickly before he was elected. Or the Israel-Iran conflict, where he has seemingly declared premature victory on that before we know exactly what the extent of the damage was to Iran. And more recently, President Trump boasted that China's President Xi has promised not to invade Taiwan during his term. He has bragged about the fact that he says China's President Xi has promised to him that he won't invade China during his term, as if this is a good thing. What an incredibly short-sighted, self-serving, quote, accomplishment. If invading Taiwan is bad now, it's still bad 3.5 years from now. And it's been U.S. policy for many decades to stand with Taiwan. Russia didn't invade until after President Trump's first term. And I agree with President Trump. I don't think there's any way Russia would have invaded if President Trump had been confirmed the winner in 2020 and served a second term previously. Russia didn't invade during President Trump's first term, but it's still just as damaging to international security. They did it after his term. And that would be the case after President Trump's term, this second term, if Taiwan was to be invaded by China after he left office. How is he seemingly not concerned beyond the next 3.5 years? We all know how fast that time's going to go. The only exception where it seems to be that he's thinking beyond his 3.5 years, is his flirtation with the idea of a third term. And I must say that it's embarrassing to watch some of these Republican clowns who are grifting off of that to gain his favor. They're fundraising, they're echoing or repeating calls for him to run for, or serve a third term, proposing legislation or constitutional amendments to allow him to serve a third term. But that said, just a side note, I wonder if President Trump will permit J.D. Vance or anyone else from his administration to run during his term. I don't happen to believe that J.D. Vance is the heavy favorite that everybody else seems to think that he is to be the nominee in 28. But will Trump let the focus turn to someone else while he's still in office? This would typically begin next year, immediately after, if not before, the 26 midterms. You know, it's always at least 2 years out that you begin to have the individuals declare their intent to run for president in the next presidential election. Will President Trump let someone who reports to him and works for him become the center of attention, especially as it relates to after his time in office? Will he let someone from his administration establish their own post-Trump identity with his blessing? That's going to be interesting to watch over the months ahead. Third area where I believe President Trump has been wrong is government reach into the free market system. I would not have expected this to happen during President Trump's second term here in these last few months. But President Trump has consistently expanded ownership of private companies, he's been involved with creating a sovereign wealth fund or doing an executive action to that effect, and creating a central bank digital currency, a CBDC, by his push for the Genius Act to be passed last month. Most concerning is that President Trump seems genuinely surprised and confused by conservative criticism of the government owning a stake in private businesses. The next most concerning is, again, the reluctance of many elected Republicans, most elected Republicans, and Trump First media to call this out. The silence of these elected Republicans and Trump First media members is deafening and deeply concerning. What would be the response if Biden was engaged in all these different efforts to take ownership or ownership stake in private companies, or to intervene in the free market system? Right is right, no matter who does it. Wrong is wrong, no matter who does it. The federal government under President Trump recently took 10% ownership stake in Intel in return for Intel to receive the Biden CHIPS Act funding. This was a move that was supported by none other than Bernie Sanders, who, when the CHIPS Act passed back in 2022, Bernie Sanders refused to vote for it unless the federal government got an ownership stake in these companies. And now Trump is doing that. I believe the CHIPS Act was bad policy. It was borrowing and giving $53 billion to companies to supposedly boost domestic semiconductor research and manufacturing with a goal to grow the U.S. Piece of the international market from 12% to 20%. It was sponsored by the liberal Democrat senator from Virginia, Mark Warner. And in the House, on the Republican side, 187 Republicans, including myself, we voted against it, and only the 24 most liberal Republicans voted for it back in 2022. So it was bad policy. And President Trump himself called for it to be repealed just back in March, 5 months ago. But now he's for it, and due to the fact that his administration was able to negotiate a 10% ownership stake in Intel in exchange for Intel getting their share of the money. In addition, President Trump is letting NVIDIA and Advanced Micro Devices sell microchips to China in return for the federal government getting a 15% of the revenue, 15% share of the revenue from that. So the administration is approving chip sales to China if we get 15% of the revenue. Is this a national security issue or isn't it? Why were we prohibiting it before and now we're reversing course just because of the federal government's ownership stake? In addition, the administration is paying $400 million to get majority control of MP Materials' rare earth mining operations. The Trump administration approved Japanese Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. Steel in exchange for what's been called a golden share of the company. So the Trump administration is allowing the Japanese company to buy the U.S. Steel company, U.S. Steel, in exchange for the federal government getting a share of the combined company. The fact is the federal government should not be competing with private businesses or controlling private companies. There's great risk of unfair advantage or treatment with a company that's owned by the federal government. There's the risk of unfair or biased government policies to benefit the companies that the federal government has an ownership stake in. Quite honestly, these are China-like policies. This is socialism, no matter who does it. We should be taking steps instead to do things like privatizing Amtrak, which is a wholly owned company by the federal government, which lost $700 million last year because of the inefficiencies of federal ownership. We should be doing things like privatizing Amtrak, not expanding government control of companies. The fourth and final main area that I'll point out where President Trump has been wrong or is wrong is where he's reversing his positions or just simply taking wrong or ridiculous positions, harmful positions, I would submit, to appeal to popularity or to establish his own legacy. For whatever reason, he has resisted, this would not be based on popularity, but he has resisted the release of the Epstein files, which I would call a wrong policy decision. I think this is indefensible on the behalf of him or any other Republican. Again, we need to stand for blind justice, everyone being equal under law. And when it comes to the Epstein files, truth, transparency, and accountability, let the chips fall where they may. President Trump is wrong to call for Canada to be the 51st state. That would be like adding California on steroids into the Electoral College. Canada is about the same size as California, but it's even more liberal than California. If Canada came into the United States, we would never win a presidential election again. And you would have 2 more Senate seats for Canada, so forget keeping control of the Senate. What a terrible policy to be in favor of making Canada the 51st state. He's wrong to talk about taking over Greenland by force, saying, hey, we hope we don't have to use troops to do that. I think that's wrong for the United States to threaten that. He's taken populist positions that I think are wrong, talking about sending out $5,000 Doge rebate checks to Americans, talking about, again, mandatory spending being off the table, that we're not going to address Social Security, Medicare, or even Medicaid. I think he was wrong to drive the $6,000 tax cut for seniors that was part of the big ugly bill. Seniors are the wealthiest of Americans. They have the most household wealth, the most savings, the most investments, and they didn't need a $6,000 tax cut that would further exacerbate the national debt. And then even his policies like no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, which I don't think are going to greatly stimulate the economy, but they're expiring after his term. I think that's bad policy. For that matter, his delaying of spending cuts until after his term in the big ugly bill, and again, other tax cuts expiring after his term, I think that's bad policy. He's called for capping credit card interest rates. That's bad policy. He's called for paid family leave, expanded paid family leave, bad policy. He has supported farm subsidies that I think are bad policy. And for that matter, amnesty for farm workers, illegal alien farm workers, and amnesty for illegal hospitality workers in restaurants and in hotels. Instead of giving amnesty to illegals who are working in these industries, we ought to stop paying able-bodied working-age Americans not to work. We need to have cuts to Medicaid, to food stamps, to cash welfare and housing subsidies, and get Americans back to work, able-bodied working-age Americans. President Trump has resisted spending cuts to these programs and hasn't driven Congress to implement those. He hasn't pushed moderates and Republican leadership to cut spending and to cut these welfare programs. Our farms need this, our businesses need this, our economy needs this, and it will reduce the deficit. President Trump is wrong to reverse his stance on the ban of TikTok, apparently because he was told that TikTok helped him win his reelection. Not enforcing the new law. President Trump's administration has not been enforcing the law passed by Congress last year, which he at that time supported. I voted for, and Congress passed a law that would ban TikTok in the United States unless ByteDance sold off TikTok to an American company and didn't allow it to continue to be owned by a Chinese company, because TikTok is the most addictive of all social media apps for American youth. and it also is giving China just incredible access from a national security standpoint to our country. But not only is President Trump's administration not enforcing the ban, but the White House has recently opened up a TikTok account. And President Trump more recently has said that he'd like to have the government to have a 50% ownership stake in TikTok if he can find a U.S. company to buy it from ByteDance. President Trump has called for allowing 500,000 Chinese students to be in our universities. I think that's a mistake. I don't think we ought to be allowing Chinese students to be studying STEM on our college campuses. And for that matter, we ought to be eliminating Chinese influence on our college campus, or for that matter, adversarial nations' influence on college campuses. Trump recently called for to consider reclassifying marijuana as a Schedule III drug instead of a Schedule I drug. And again, why aren't conservative media outlets covering this? There's reports that President Trump received significant campaign donations in 2024 to his reelection campaign from the marijuana industry. But this would be a massive boost financially to the marijuana industry with new tax deductibility for business expenses if marijuana is a Class 3 drug instead of a Class 1 drug. I guess TikTok users like to smoke weed, but I can tell you here in Virginia, where they have reduced the criminality of marijuana a couple of years ago when Democrats had full control of government, it smells like weed everywhere you go already here in Virginia. And my question is, when has marijuana made things better anywhere? If this happens, you're going to have increased access for kids, greater dependency, greater addiction, more unemployment, more homelessness. Marijuana is a gateway drug. It harms, ruins society wherever we have more of it. And I think President Trump is wrong to talk about reclassifying it. President Trump has also supported the creation of a central bank digital currency, or a CBDC, after promising not to do so. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this. We'll go into more depth on this in a future podcast. But the Genius Act that passed back in July is essentially creating a digital dollar, a stable coin, which would replace cash and enable government control. This is massive potential for abuse. Think of what happened during COVID with the restrictions and the enforcement of those restrictions. Think about debanking because on your views on the Second Amendment or climate or diversity, equity, inclusion, or LGBT or DEI, those sorts of things. Think about a Democrat administration having this kind of power. This is the exact opposite of what President Trump pledged to do after he was elected. He said he would ban CBDCs, again, central bank digital currencies, but the Genius Act stablecoins are essentially CBDCs. Matter of fact, the bill text reads, quote, "A permitted payment stablecoin issuer shall be treated as a financial institution and shall be subject to all federal laws applicable to financial institutions located in the United States, including policies and procedures to block, freeze, and reject specific or impermissible transactions that violate federal or state laws, rules, or regulations." So in other words, this central bank digital currency could be used to block the financial transactions, freeze those transactions based on politics of the federal government. 12 Republicans, only 12, courageously voted against the Genius Act in the House when it passed back in July because President Trump strongly supported it. And again, this is going to create a digital dollar, the stable coin, which is essentially a CBDC, and it'll give the federal government unprecedented power and control over the assets of Americans. 12 Republicans voted against it, and I want to read them out. Thomas Massie, for some reason, missed the vote. I'm sure he would have voted against it. But the 12 who did vote against it were Andy Biggs from Arizona, Eric Burleson from Missouri, Michael Cloud from Texas, Eli Crane from Arizona, Warren Davidson from Ohio, Russ Fulcher from Idaho, Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, Morgan Griffith from Virginia, Andy Harris from Maryland, Scott Perry from Pennsylvania, Chip Roy from Texas, and Austin Scott from Georgia. Those 12 were the only 12 Republicans with the courage to vote against it. Finally, as far as things where President Trump's been wrong, he issued an executive action creating a sovereign wealth fund. Sovereign wealth fund. This is further incentive for the federal government to intervene in the economy, making politically favored investments. This would be using, and the federal government had the potential to use their investor influence to push a political agenda. Again, it's not about this administration, it's about this administration and future administrations. For that matter, the federal government doesn't have any money to invest. We don't run a government surplus. We don't have extra revenue or a savings account. So the government would have to borrow print money to invest in this sovereign wealth fund, which would further cause inflation. There's no legal basis for the president to do this without Congress, and it's Congress that has the power to make bad policy like this, and they shouldn't do it. Once again, just a summary there. President Trump is not right about everything, and that's important for us to recognize as conservatives, as Republicans, to support him when he's right, and he's right more often than not, but to confront him and to challenge him and to resist him when he's wrong. He needs principled, courageous conservatives to oppose him when he's wrong. For the most part, we are not getting that today in Congress. We're not getting that from most of conservative media. And whether President Trump knows or not, he and the country need more Congress members like Thomas Massie in the House and Rand Paul in the Senate. It seems more likely that maybe we'll get more states added to the union like Kentucky than we're going to get more courageous, principled Congress members. And for that matter, we better hope Thomas Massie wins his primary next year, or Republicans will be even more subordinate or submissive to President Trump in the second half of his term. On the other hand, if Thomas Massie wins, in spite of the $1 million of spending that's already being launched against him, then I think that'll inspire more Republicans to take courageous, principled stands. In the meantime, we as a people must demand principled actions from our representatives, that they show courage and consistency as principled conservatives, principled constitutional conservatives. That is our role in helping to keep the republic. So thank you again for joining this episode of the Good for America podcast. Please subscribe to the show, subscribe to the podcast, rate the show, refer it to your friends, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Let's keep the republic.